I'm Megan, and I am looking at sign language interpreting, deconstructing the myth of neutrality with Melanie Metzger for Biblical Heritage for the BIC. And I'm going to talk about Chapter 1 today. And, I'm going to talk about the first 50 pages of the book today. And basically, she begins by talking about the 3 types of communication from language to language. And so, wisely, she starts out with an example that hearing people can really wrap their heads around, and it's the Bible. She talks about how these original texts that are in these either dead languages or unspoken languages or coded languages are translated from those languages into English or into whatever language. And that is called translation. And that means it is from a text to another text. And then there's interpretation, which means that we're taking a text to another text that is, or another text or a spoken or signed language that is not necessarily exactly the same as the original text. And then transliteration means that we're taking a text or speech or something like that into exactly the same literal meaning that it came from the original text. She talks a little bit about how Aristotle addresses these concerns about translation, and he really talks about how it's important for translators to be accurate and equivalent. And she kind of contrasts that with how Cicero suggests that changing a language to fit sort of the audience is necessary, because, both Aristotle and Cicero were translators of different texts and different things that they had come across, and it was important at that time to get that out to the public. And so Cicero sort of saw that, we're taking this original text, which who knows what it was, and bringing it into sort of how we speak now, and it doesn't make sense to these people. So Cicero thought, it's important for us to translate in a way, interpret in a way that where the text makes sense to the audience, and so that would be an interpretation and not a transliteration or a translation. And so there are 2 types of equivalence underneath the Cicero or underneath Aristotle's section, and there's formal equivalence, which means that it matches form and content exactly. And then there's dynamic equivalence, which means that a target text yields an effect on a target audience that is really similar to the effect of the source text on the original audience. So, for example, if, and I'm just going to apply it to sign language interpreting, if a speaker tells a joke, a hearing speaker tells a joke, and the interpreter has to interpret that joke for the deaf audience, if the hearing people laugh at the joke, the deaf people would ultimately, hopefully, laugh at the joke because it's funny to everybody, and it made sense in the interpretation to the deaf people the way that it made sense to the hearing people. And so all of these things kind of come into play when we talk about translating art, translating theater, translating poetry, and it sort of, she goes into a section about how, there's been some poems that are 5 or 6 words that sort of trigger this heartbreaking feeling, this melancholy, and that is something that we as interpreters kind of have to think about, like, is that possible for us to do when we interpret from English to ASL? How is it possible for these 5 words that maybe don't even have signs? How can we take that feeling and that meaning and that content and the form and bring it over into ASL? So in the next section, she talks about how sometimes the hearing people and deaf people have a disconnect in their communication because hearing people, and I mean certainly in America, so often tend to say things that they don't actually mean. They speak in a way that is not literal, and deaf people are extremely direct. They say exactly what they mean. They kind of say things that maybe would be inappropriate to say out loud in English, but in ASL it's fine because they're very direct people. So, for example, we would never say, you know, after you see someone after a while, you know, and they've maybe gained some weight, you wouldn't say, oh my God, you're so fat now. And, you know, deaf people wouldn't say that either, but they might say, wow, you used to be so thin and now you're not. And that's not really offensive for them. That's just kind of honesty. It's just, you know, what they would say. And so when we think about a text or a speech or something like that, when we're translating and interpreting into ASL, it can kind of become a sticky situation, because, you know, if hearing people are not saying what they really mean, how are we supposed to say, okay, what do they really mean, and then sign it how they mean it? So, and also there's a kind of a conflict with, you know, if they are not saying it explicitly, then is it appropriate to say what they mean explicitly? So, free translation, which is something that Cicero believed in, is a translation that is produced in an accessible register of the target language, using as many or as few words as necessary to convey the same sense as the source text. Furthermore, the situation influences what kind of translation is needed. So Cicero really believed that there is nothing wrong with receiving a source text and then looking at it, analyzing it, and deciding what it really means, what's the core of the message, and translating it into something that's readable. So no matter what, equivalence is the key for interpreters and for translators. And Melanie Metzger says it is the heart of the field, and it is the heart of any field that aims to get information from one language or from one source to another. So the next section is about sociolinguistics, and sociolinguistics is a study of translation and interpretation with regard to social and cultural issues, and it is really behind the sense that a text conveys beyond the meaning and the words. So an author named Pergnier said, interpretation is not simply the conveyance of meaning between two languages, but rather between two languages and the communities and cultures of the people who use them. So it's so important right now in this day and age where, you know, hearing people are not being as direct as they need to be, and then deaf people are being super direct, to sort of mediate that and kind of come up with a way to accommodate both cultures. So in one of the final parts of this chapter, Metzger talks about the difference in modes of translation and interpretation, as she sort of steps out of translation, which would be from a text to another text or from text to speech. She moves into interpretation, which is mainly from source speech to source sign to, you know, and back and forth. An author named Seleskovich says, interpreters have to understand the sense of the original utterance and its function within the context in which it occurs. And this, however, is limited by time, and ASL interpreters usually don't have a ton of time. So the biggest difference in translation and interpretation is time. ASL interpreters rarely have a lot of time to receive information and then to spit it back out in ASL or to spit it back out in English. You know, if it's a situation like a speech or a doctor's office or really any kind of interview, there's not really that kind of time to say, okay, can you repeat that? Can you rephrase that? Can you spell that for me? That's not really how, because that really slows down that communication between the deaf person and the hearing person, which is really the point, is so that they can communicate as close to how we are communicating with each other now. So first and foremost, the text is not permanently at their fingertips. They're not able to look at a page and say, okay, and then take the time to really receive that information, process it, and then come up with an interpretation. It is rarely written. It is usually not written. Songs, a lot of times, you can kind of go and look at the lyrics and learn the songs. But anything else, any other kind of communication, you're not going to get it more than once. Which means they have to be really good listeners. And it does not have time to be reviewed. Once again, you just kind of have to hear it and then do your best to make it into ASL or into English. So she talks about how the only real advantage is that sometimes the interpreter has the opportunity to meet the source and to meet the deaf person. So they can kind of reach a communicative understanding. So like if the hearing person maybe has certain motivations, or if they have maybe a disability of their own, or if they need something in particular, then, in the beginning, before the communication begins, the interpreter and that person can speak and sort of reach an understanding. And the same with the deaf person. If the deaf person maybe is not that great at ASL and needs something slow, or if they are amazing at ASL and they have a doctorate and they really want something that's very clear, or transliterated, then that understanding can be reached. So within ASL interpreting, there is a consecutive and simultaneous interpreting. Consecutive means that it's more on a conversational basis. So in a doctor's office, the doctor says something, I hear it, I think about it, I sign it. Hearing person says something, I get it, I say it, and so on. It's more turn-taking. And the interpreter in that way has more time to process that information, to ask questions, and to sort of seek the most understanding possible. Simultaneous, however, is when it's more for speeches and stuff. It is more efficient for time, and it is less efficient as far as precision goes, because if we're hearing a speech from, the President of the United States, or the director of a department, the chair of a committee, we're not really supposed to be there to be like, okay, hey, can you repeat that? I'm sorry, could you slow that down? That's not really our place. As far as communication specialists, we're supposed to be able to hear it immediately and turn it into ASL. And sometimes that can be really, really hard, but it is time efficient. And so finally, at the end of this chapter, Metzger talks about the interpreter's paradox, which is really similar to the observer's paradox. Basically, it means that that a communication or a situation changes wholly on the basis that there is someone observing it. So like reality TV is a really good example. People are put into a special situation on reality TV, and there are cameras everywhere. And so the cameras being there fundamentally changes the nature of what's happening there. And so sometimes we see crazy stuff on reality TV, and that's really because those people are behaving in a way that they would not necessarily behave, but because they're being observed and they're being watched, they're maybe considering the experience differently. So as far as the interpreter's paradox goes, there are 4 models of interaction by Witter and Merrithew. And the first one is helper, and that basically would just be family and friends communicating with each other, or if we're going to coffee and I have a deaf friend and I have a hearing friend, I would just interpret for them, and that's more on a casual basis, and it's turn-taking, but it's a little bit less strict as far as how the interpretation goes. And then the second one is conduits. In I think the 80s, there was the way that interpreters were being taught was extremely machinery. They were taught, you're a robot, you're a machine, you're a conduit. You take that message and you send it over exactly how you heard it, nothing else, nothing more. And so in the book she said that caused some mistrust between interpreters and the deaf community, because interpreters are kind of supposed to be advocates for the deaf, but they were being taught to kind of keep it neutral. And so that's sort of the argument that goes on in the book. The third one is communication facilitator, which kind of raises the bar for expertise, but is a lot like the conduit one. And then bilingual and bicultural specialist is sort of the most recent, the one that's sort of the most progressive right now, and it goes along with the historical progression. So whatever the need is culturally and multiculturally, biculturally, it kind of goes along with that as far as interpreting goes. So interpreters go in and out of these roles depending on where they are, depending on the situation, but their presence does influence the interaction that is taking place. So no matter which one of these models they're a part of, they're being there, it changes the communication fundamentally. In chapter 2, she talks mainly about how the research for her study of medical interviews is going to be conducted. It's going to be pretty brief because it's a lot of science and it's a lot of process. But first and foremost, she talks about how some of the consistent features in a communication event can indicate how we analyze it. So first and foremost, the setting. Second, the participants' goals, and third, the discourse that is going on in that interaction. So there are three things to consider when we examine the larger context and the local context in an interaction. And so first, it would be the situation. So that would be, are we at a party? Are we in a mall? Are we at a graduation, a football game, etc.? And then secondly, the speech event. So are we having a conversation? Is this a back and forth, or is this a mainly I'm hearing and you're listening type of situation? And then thirdly, it is the speech act, and that is the function of the utterances. So is it a joke? Is it supposed to be meant really seriously? Is it a figure of speech? Is it figurative language in general? And so all of that kind of comes into play when we're looking at how a communication is going. So in the example she uses, she talks about code switching as a joke in a gathered setting. So the example is that this guy who is of color is at a party it's sort of a fancy party. It's maybe a wine tasting or something, with several other students who are white and professors who are white. And so all along he's talking sort of normally, how we do a little small talk at a party. And so the professor comes along and says that he's going to offer him a letter of recommendation. And so the guy says, as he's walking towards the professor's office, he says, "I'm gonna get me a gig," to his white friends. And so that's an example of code switching, which is something that exists in all languages. It's sort of, when we go from speaking like most people do to speaking in sort of a language all to ourselves or to our culture. And so in this case, it's sort of more of a hood speak, if you will. So not PC, but and so the example just means, the situation was a party, the event was a conversation, really, a joke, and then the speech act was a joke. And so let's say that someone wanted to interpret that situation, how would they say, "I'm gonna get me a gig"? That's kind of not, that's not really English. So it's not really proper English. So the interpreter puts down, "I'm going to get myself set up for my future," or something like that. And it's really basic and not how it came out of his mouth. And so, but the deaf community would not really understand that. It wouldn't make sense to them how he put what he said. And so that's one of the things that she considers in the book. So medical interviews is the second part of this chapter, and it talks about some of the big problems that come into play when there's differences in language and culture and background knowledge and goals. And that leads to sort of ineffective policy, unnecessary operations, unnecessary purchases, sort of wasted money and wasted time. And so medical interviews in particular sort of have this natural level of asymmetry between people, because it's even when hearing people go to the hospital, it's sort of, this is a doctor that knows a lot and that is very smart and that went to school for a very long time and kind of knows something that I don't know inherently. And then I'm sort of a innocent person that doesn't necessarily know anything about what maybe is going on with my health. And so the ball is really in the doctor's court, and the power is in the doctor's court. And so she goes into a lot about how the research is going to be conducted and what goes into finding it, and how we can kind of analyze in real medical interviews how this power play and the language difference and the cultural difference comes into play into medical interviews. And so she goes on and on and on about how it's going to be conducted, where the cameras will be, a little bit more about the observer's paradox, and really just how the rest of the book is going to go, how those interviews are going to be observed and analyzed. So I will see you in chapter 3. The big question for this section, which I will answer in 1 month, in the analysis portion of this blog is, if interpreters are participants in an interaction, should they be as free as other participants to influence the structure and outcomes of the encounter? So that is a big question.